Lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and run this workshop for you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Some of you I may have met before in other contexts, but for new faces, really nice to meet you. So I'll just say a little bit about myself, and then I'll say a little bit about Rareminds in my presentation. So some of you may know me as clinical director at Rareminds. I'm also a psychotherapist. I have been for nearly 30 years now. And during that time also worked with organisation leaders and teams and groups in a sort of organisational consultancy context, of which emotional resilience and well-being is always a really important topic. So it's a pleasure to come and share some thoughts with you today. So my first task is to share my screen. So let's hope that goes smoothly. I'll just bring you up. Okay, so we're going to be talking about a really key area in patient group leadership, which is looking after your own emotional well-being. So just tell you a little bit about Rareminds for those of you who don't know us. We have 3 mission pillars at Rareminds. We're quite a new organisation. We started in 2020, and we're about direct service provision to organisations, patient communities in terms of counselling, programmes, workshops and talks for patient groups and wellbeing resources. The second pillar, which we built in from the start, which we felt was really, really important, was supporting the supporters, which is people like yourselves. So providing training, consultancy, and really awareness and support for those in any leadership role. And also very much part of our mission is sort of flying the flag for rare diseases and mental health, raising awareness of the mental health challenges faced by those living with rare conditions, and as a result contributing to research, policy and good practice. That's our website if you'd like to take a look at who and where we are. And if you want to follow us on social media, that would be great. I've promised to mention that. So what are we going to do together today? We're going to take the focus off the needs of your community and onto yourselves as leaders. And really very much what I want you to be thinking about today is making a bit of a mental shift for those of you that are here as mentees, and thinking about making a transition to the relationship with your community as not just being a participant. I know a lot of you will come up through your communities to take a leadership role, but starting to think about it as work. And thinking about it in part 1, we'll be talking about what we in Rareminds think are very distinct features of rare leaders. You have very unique challenges and pressures upon you, and very unique characteristics too. And then in part 2, we're going to look at ways of being mindful of these and some practical strategies to help support your own emotional well-being and thrive and avoid burnout. And I'm sure all of you here will be working in very pressured environments with lots on. So I don't want you to feel that you have to remember all that we're going to cover today. If there's just 1 or 2 takeaways that you want to take forward into your own lives and into your own work, that's the way to think about it. So just see what you notice, what strikes you from our workshop today. And that will be the thing that's important to you. Don't strive too hard to remember all of it. Okay, so just a few guidelines. I will move between language of we and you, because I also consider myself as running a patient community. And I will move between rare diseases and genetic conditions and rare conditions. I know people have different preferences for language. And similarly too with communities, patient organisations and charities and groups, I'll move between those. And just beginning to think a little bit more about this idea of work in relation to your patient community, whether you're in a voluntary capacity or within a paid capacity. That's a little bit of making a transition to think about your relationship to your community and to your work in a different sort of way, which might help you to manage it just a little bit more easily going forward. So some of you might know me from a series of groups that we ran through Rareminds called Building Rare Resilience for Leaders. And from that, and from conversations with rare leaders over the last couple of years, it's become very evident that there's very distinct and unique characteristics of rare leaders as a sort of bunch, as a community in your own right. You're all very much creative visionaries and innovators. And there's a certain sort of personality dynamic that will go along with that. And most of you here, I know, will also be founders. Now, all of you, or many of you, will have had your communities come about because they've been birthed, if you like, through disappointment, through seeing a lack. And that gives you all a very high drive to affect change. And most of you here will be values driven. You're not going to be financially driven. And that means that you have a very high moral compass often, and a very high vision for what you want your communities to achieve, and the pressures that you then may put on yourselves accordingly. Most of you will have a tendency to prioritize other needs over your own needs. Many of you here will be juggling perhaps children with a rare condition, or your own health issues, or other caring responsibilities, or your own work, and are running your communities on top of that. So this is a tall order. You're already doing a lot. So you will be primed for a tendency to prioritize other needs over your own. You're doing all of this in the context of limited and scant resources, often of time, money, and support. And you're often caught in the middle of expectations between those of trusters, your funders, and your community. So being a patient leader is often a little bit about being caught in the middle. Whose needs do you attend to first? Whose expectations are going to be greatest at any one time? And of course, the other thing we can't ignore too is that many of you will lone working or in small teams, and your home place and your workplace in relation to your community may well be the same. So finding boundaries between the two, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute, is also a tall order for you. It's not like you go out to a workplace, leave your work there and come back. And the really key aspect of all this is that many of you will be working directly from lived experience, which is the thing that I think marks you out very much as a group from other leaders in other contexts, because lived experience heightens everything you do, both in and outside your community. The stakes are higher, if you like. The successes and failures that you have impact more keenly because you know what it feels like. You know what it means to be living with the rare conditions that you're supporting. So everything is felt that much more personally, whether it's a success or whether it's something that hasn't gone so well. And that empathy and that identification with your community also means that you have a higher tendency to override all your own needs too. And a phrase that one of my colleagues uses, which I think is a really helpful one, is that, you are being the light, but being the light also carries the risk of burning yourself out. And that's something that attending to as a patient leader and finding ways to support yourself, get support from others so that you don't burn out, like coming to these sorts of workshops, finding communities of support, is absolutely key and central to thriving as a patient leader. So I'm just putting up here some of the sort of paraphrases of quotes that people have said to us as leaders over the last few years, and just sort of let your eye roll over them and think, oh yes, that one relates to me. That one, I think, that's definitely something I felt at different times. I certainly know from my experience, one of the ways that Rareminds came into being, because I was looking around thinking, surely at some point someone will set up a mental health organisation for those with rare conditions. And I kept looking around and thinking, oh, that's going to be me then. And I'm sure many of you here have also had that experience. You started your community because it needed to come into existence, and you were the one who stepped into that space. So what I'd like us to do is just start with a short exercise together. And I'd like you to go into groups of 4. I really hope this works, because it always feels a little bit risky and exciting when we do breakout groups. So Hannah's putting you into groups of 4, and it'll be a mixed group of mentors and mentees. And I'd like you to just introduce yourselves to each other and talk a bit about your organisation. Do you work alone? Do you have volunteers working with you? Do you have any other supports in place? How many hours a week do you give to your community in terms of your work? And this is where I want you to start thinking about, how much time do I give my community in a week in relation to my caring responsibilities or my employment responsibilities? How much time does it take? Does it feel demanding? Does it feel about right? And think about it in the context of the other commitments you have. And then what I also want you to do is talk to each other about what resonated with you or spoke to you from this first part. You know, what jumped out at you and you thought, yeah, that I can identify with, that I can relate to. So we'll do that for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and I'll ask some of you to share with the bigger group about what you talked about in your small groups. So if you want to allocate a spokesman during this time too, that would be great. So let's move on a bit. So what I'm going to do in this second part really is start to look with you a bit at taking up your leadership role, either in a new way, if you've been a leader for a while, or thinking about taking it up from start if you're beginning your journey as a patient leader, and starting to bring in this distinction of a different relationship to your community if you've come up from your patient communities, to start really identifying what you do as work, because that will help you to start drawing some of the boundaries that we were talking about earlier that are so difficult. So when I mean work, I mean whether you are paid in your role or whether you are volunteering in your role, it is, start thinking about it as work. My relationship to my community is a piece of work that I do. And that allows you to start making conscious choices and drawing boundaries around that work, about when you do it, where you do it, and how much of it you do. And one of the things I want you to be really mindful of is you will probably always feel that you are never doing enough. And that's a difficult feeling to have to manage, but sort of acknowledging it and going, that goes with the territory of being a rare leader, because there is often so much need in your communities and so much that needs to be done. It is true that one person cannot meet all that need, and there will always be more to be done. So sort of almost settling into that, and then learning how to set priorities accordingly and work with your boards and your colleagues to decide what you can do right now and what might need to wait. And being mindful, as we were talking about at the start, that you are unique as rare leaders, because your lived experience makes it extra hard for you to say no and to step back or to say not now, because you will have had that happen to you in your own lives, and you know how hard it is when you might need to say it to a community member or a group or an activity you might want to be involved in, but you just don't have capacity for right now. But finding that balance is really, really important for you in order to be able to sustain your relationship with your community over time. If you sort of run it at full tilt at the start and sort of, you know, it's a bit like, think of this as a marathon, not a sprint. This is about creating a relationship with your community that is sustainable and rewarding for you over time. And that means finding both what I'm going to call internal boundaries and external boundaries, and how you relate to your community. And we all need support and encouragement with finding and keeping boundaries. It's not about being rigid. It's not about being inflexible. It's about knowing what in principle you are able to offer and give in terms of time and energy. And when you're prepared to sort of move or shift those boundaries a bit, but then return back to the middle, if you like. Okay, so I'm just going to step back a little bit though and touch on something that is very much in the pot with all of this stuff, which is, why do we say yes when often we want to say no, or we should say no, or not now? And I'm talking about that sense of when you start to feel you're going a bit beyond what you really are able to offer at any one time in terms of your time or your energy, and it will come at a cost to you. perhaps to your own personal relationships or your own health or well-being. And often we end up saying yes, down to really quite sort of three simple but difficult emotions, which are our fears of being rejected, or of someone being angry with us, or being disappointing to someone. And again, this is where you're vulnerable, because you will all have been disappointed at some point on your course of your journey with your rare condition. And that's been a driver, as we said at the start, to bring your communities into existence and to be leaders, to mitigate disappointment for others. Guilt, a belief or desire that we should be doing something better or differently. You know, I should be doing this, therefore I will say yes because I know it's important. Or shame. Sometimes we step into a commitment, or we step into perhaps a conversation or relationship because we're worried about not being good enough, or we worry about how we're perceived by another if we say, I'm sorry, I need to step back. So holding on to this sense of yourselves, that part of your identity as rare leaders is often very much about a desire not to disappoint. You have a strong drive to meet need. And many of you also have a struggle to accept your own or others' limitations, because leaders often do. Leaders are innovators, they are creatives, they want to go out and make things different. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating when we come up against our own limitations in that regard of time or knowledge or resources, or sometimes when we come up against others too. And the reason this is important is because being aware of these underlying feelings that can drive a lot of our behaviour can help us make more conscious and considered choices, rather than getting pulled into situations or dynamics that may not be in our own best interests, or may not be in our organisation's best interests in the long term. So it's a bit about sort of saying, what am I getting pulled into here? If I'm feeling some resistance or anxiety in myself about whether I should do this, maybe I just step back and think about what that is. And if I've got caught into saying yes, has it come about through one of these feelings in the background? So just to focus a little bit more on boundaries, which I think are absolutely key to your emotional resilience and your well-being as leaders. As I said, boundaries can get a bad rap, as if they're sort of, being rigid or controlling. They're not. They're about keeping everyone safe, about managing expectations, knowing what you're able to do and you're not able to do, what you're up for, what you're not up for. So what I call an internal boundary is really your personal capacity to draw a line around and give yourself permission for an importance for your own needs, your own preferences, and your own desires. So those boundaries internally are different for all of us. Some of us might like to work late at night, others might like to work early morning. Some of us are more extroverted, so are happy to have all sorts of conversations during a day. Others of you might need more rest time, you might need more private time. So internal boundaries and maintaining those are absolutely essential for your work with your communities going forward. Now, external boundaries help support internal boundaries. These two work together. And they are the boundaries that we draw around time, around our physical environment, about our roles and responsibilities or other activities. And they help us preserve internal boundaries. So the two very much have to work together. If you try and set an external boundary without paying attention to your internal one, it'll be much harder to keep, and vice versa. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about inner boundaries and ways to support them. And I'm thinking of a situation where perhaps we've probably all had it, where you get asked to do something. Could you do this? Could you send me this? Or could I talk to you then? Or could you be involved in this project? And you think, oh yeah, it sounds really, really interesting. Oh, I'm not quite sure whether we can do that right now. And often we have a sort of a background feeling of not quite sure, and paying attention to that can be really important. And one of the things that I think as rare leaders we are particularly sensitive to is knowing what I might call when you have your passion goggles on. I think someone mentioned this earlier, and I can be caught up in this as much as anyone. That you see a task or a project or an activity and you think, oh, that'd be so great to be involved in, and I really want us to be part of that. And maybe someone says, you'd be great at this, would you come and be involved? And you think, oh, I'm wanted and I want to do it. And before you know it, you've got yourself signed up for something that's going to take more time or energy or resources than you have at this particular moment. So one of the things I often encourage people to do is any commitments that you might make, either to individuals or projects or your board, is have a personal cooling off period, particularly if you found yourself getting really excited about something, because sometimes then we can override sort of a more pragmatic aspect of us. So if you think you might have passion goggles on at certain points or prone to putting passion goggles on, insert a bit of a cooling off period. So I have above my desk, I have a picture of this image here, which is press the pause button. It's really just to remind me not to get too carried away and too enthusiastic about getting involved in things until I've thought it through. So really that thinking it through means, do I need to respond straight away? You know, this is about inserting a bit of a pause. Often we feel we want to be very responsive as patient leaders because, going back to the start, you probably not have had experiences of not being responded to in the way that you would have liked on the journey with your rare condition. So that means you have a strong driver to want to be responsive. And that's a great quality. But it's about also allowing yourself space to say, I may not need to respond to everything straight away or right now if it comes at a cost to my own stress levels or my own well-being. Sometimes you might need time to think about how to respond. The initial response you have may not be quite right. You might want to think it through. How do we want to respond to this? And in situations particularly where you're unsure, you may be being asked to do something or take something on you're not sure about, talk it over with someone you trust. You know, and this is where it's great with having mentors on this workshop too, because I would say that your mentors are part of that. They are there to help you make decisions when your inner impulse maybe to take something on or take something up, and thinking it through clearly and pragmatically with someone a little bit one step removed is really worth its weight in gold. And in due course, that might be a colleague or it might be a trustee. But thinking through with another really helps us maintain those inner boundaries when our impulses may sometimes seek to override them. I'm going to talk a bit now more about external boundaries, and these really focus around space, around time, around technology and social media, and about roles and within relationships. And one of the things I would really encourage you to do when you go away from today is to think about what aspects of your external boundaries might you want to pay a little bit more attention to. What is working well for you, and where do you struggle? Where do you get pulled into responding or reacting or relating in a way that becomes stressful for you? And, you know, we'll talk about different aspects of this in our groups, but I know particularly when we have moved to a lot of online working, and someone was saying this earlier, it's much harder in all sorts of ways to find boundaries with when you're sort of on and when you're off, because in a sense, social media, notifications, our smartphones mean that we're sort of always available, and it's very seductive because part of you will want to be always available, and we all have, I think, a little bit of a fear of missing out or missing things. So this is about learning to manage too sometimes a bit of inner discomfort, that I'm choosing to put a boundary in place here for my longer term resilience and well-being, even though in the short term I might find it a little bit difficult to do or a little bit troublesome in some way. So some of these will be things that have probably occurred to you or might have occurred to you, or you might have even started trying to do. And as we go through these different aspects of working, I just want you to do a sort of little mental audit. How am I in this area? Is this something I'm managing well, or is this something I could do a little bit of work on and get a little bit firmer for myself? So one of the things, particularly as I imagine most of you will be doing your work with your communities in your home place, your workplace and your home place are more muddled up, trying to find some artificial boundary where this is where you go to work, can help you find that boundary with your community. You can pick your work up and you can put your work down in a sort of mental way. I always miss having a commute, which I never thought I would ever say. But because a commute allows you to have a kind of separation between your home place, your family, your personal responsibilities and time, and then the place where you go to work. So we have to find sort of tricks, if you like, to find a way of making a transition time between when we're working and when we're not working. So that might be something really simple if you've got a little space, either a desk or even just a space on a table. I know some people like having a cupboard that they can put work away in, so they mentally close that cupboard at the end of the period they've chosen to decide not to work. I am now working, I open the cupboard, I'm now not working, the cupboard is closed. There's something about cupboards too, which is a bit like saying I'm tucking away my community in this cupboard for a bit. It's safe, but it's there when I can open it up again. Obviously, if you have the opportunity for a separate room or an office at home, that's great. And some of you I know also have a separation between your sort of domestic and your work as a portal on your laptop or your PC. And that can be another way to create some of these boundaries. And I'm also a really big believer in making work, whether that's at home or in a workplace, as comfortable and as nice as possible. Sometimes you might want a change of scene. Can you go out and do some work in another space for a bit with other people around you? And it's so easy to, be sitting in front of a laptop or doing your work for sort of 2 or 3 hours at a time. And before you know it, it's, that time has passed and you've been sitting in one space or lying in one space. And getting up to just stretch or walk around really helps your brain to sort of free up again too. We sort of sometimes need physical movement to get mental movement going too. I always encourage to try and avoid working in bed. I know for some of you that's not possible because you need to spend quite a lot of time either lying flat or being in a bed for all sorts of reasons. But even in that instance, I think if you can try and find a way of mentally going, I'm picking my laptop or my phone up and now I'm pushing it to one side, and someone very helpfully said they have a little cover that they put over their laptop and their phone so that it's on their bedside table, but it is put away for the moment. So these little rituals that demarcate work and not work or rest are really important. It's sort of things that we all sort of often know, but we don't always get around to doing. Managing your time, and someone said at the start, it's very easy. Hello? It's very easy for time to sort of just expand, and your communities will take as much time as you will give them. And I think that's something really important to register at the start. How many hours or how many days in a week can I realistically give to my community? What am I choosing to give? So rather than feeling that you are being demanded of and that demand has no end, you decide where the boundary is and you decide how much time you can give, even if that means sometimes saying, I won't be able to get around to that this week. I will be able to come to it next week or next month. So letting people down gently, but being very clear with your boundaries so everyone knows where they stand. So when you think how many hours or days a week, when are you going to do these? And this is back to the idea of have an in principle idea. This is when I am available to my community and this is when I'm not. and starting to communicate that to others on things like email signatures or your personal voicemails. Now, it is not that, as I said earlier, you can't vary that boundary, but it's about having in principle an idea of, I don't know, I work Monday, Wednesday, Friday between 9 and 12. And that's when you respond and are able to be available for meetings or things like that. Now, you can vary that. But if in principle people know that's when you're available, it means that you're in a dialogue with another where you can negotiate something. One of the things I also encourage both my team but also leaders to do is block out time for different tasks. So thinking about your time management. So, it's very easy to feel that you get an email in and you've got to respond straight away, or you get a phone call and you have to respond immediately. Try and block out time in your day. It'll help you feel more ordered with your day. I quite like to do emails first thing. So I might, do an hour on emails at the start of the day. And if anything really urgent comes in, I can answer it. But it means that I've then also got time for focused work or things that I might need to put in meetings. So you have a sense overall of this part of my day. I might do emails. I'm available in the afternoon for meetings, and block out times for if you need to do longer focused pieces of work. I know from my own experience, there's no point trying to write a proposal or a document or a policy ad hoc in between little spaces here and there. You need to block out chunks of time, a day or several hours. And the other thing I'm a big favour of is I have a few resistances to the idea of multitasking, and maybe this is just as I've got older, but I do think there is something about doing one thing at a time that means it takes the pressure off you from having to sort of, it's an email come in, or should I make this phone call? I should be doing this. Give yourself the freedom to just focus on the thing that is right in front of you at that particular moment, and try and leave other things to one side. That way, it frees up something on the inside for you to be able to just bring your attention to that one thing and then go on to do the next thing. And as I said before, having some sort of ritual that demarcates on and off time, whether that's a mini commute or a little walk or having a drink or going to the gym, putting on some music, picking up your kids, reading a bit of your book, putting on some, something that you like listening to on a podcast, anything that gives a little bit of demarcation in whatever way you are able to in your own particular circumstances. But again, that demarcating on and off time. I'm not moderating the chat, but I'm really happy if any of you have tips and ideas on this to put things in the chat if they're coming to mind as I'm talking, to help others too. Technology and social media is an absolute time sponge, as I'm sure you're all aware. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those. And one of the things that interestingly came up as a really strong theme when we were working with patient leaders before is using smartphones in a slightly different way. So because your smartphone is often the portal to your community all the time, allowing yourself to have space to either set off, to put off notifications, or even put your phone away at certain times of the day to give yourself a break, to be able to sort of engage with the physical world around you in a different sort of way. And that goes back to the boundaries in terms of, this is when I will be engaging with my community through my phone or through my work in that way. And this is when I'm choosing to put it down. I'm a really big proponent to sort of saying at the end of the day, try not to take your phone into your bedroom with you, because it's so seductive and easy to just start looking and scrolling, and before you know it, it's 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, and then you've started thinking about something that someone sent you. Try and use your phone wisely in terms of supporting the boundaries that you're choosing to make. And this includes things like have a voicemail, have a friendly voicemail that says, hi, this is so-and-so, I'm available such and such a time if you're calling me in relation to this community, and I'll try and get back to you then. So that way, you know that someone isn't wondering when you're going to get back to them because you've told them. And if you feel that, it would be helpful to have crisis or out of hours support lines, or just a kind of the odd number on your voicemail too, that can be really helpful. Again, with social media, I'd say try and schedule, try and not get too caught up with needing to be very responsive, but maybe say you spend an hour a day or an hour every other day or whatever works for you. And that's when you engage with and catch up with social media. Most people who are involved in patient communities know that everyone is doing it alongside caring responsibilities or their own health commitments or their own working responsibilities. So I think there's a lot of grace around not everyone's expecting immediate responses straight away. So don't feel pressured in the way that some of the bigger organizations are able to be very responsive, because they have people managing that aspect on their teams solely. Most of you won't be in that position. So take your foot off the pedal in that regard and just respond at times when you know that's right for you. If you haven't got a separate work email address in relation to a community, it's a really simple thing, but I would really encourage you to set that up clearly at the start. So again, you can have a demarcation between your personal and your work for your community. And again, use out of office. Out of office is also really helpful for having a break if you want to do a focused piece of work, or again, know how to set it up really simply if you need to step back, either because you're having a bit of a health crisis or perhaps one of your family is having a health crisis. So knowing how to set up an out of office, and if any of you don't know how to do that, do ask your mentors. They'll be more than happy to show you. And the other thing I was just going to say, which I know I've sometimes talked to Beacon about, I feel like there's a whole workshop itself in moderating and managing Facebook groups, because I know they take a lot of time sometimes and can generate a lot of anxiety if people post on them in quite a lot of distress. And certainly if that's something you'd like us at Rareminds to help you look at, or with Beacon, I'm sure we'd be happy to, because a lot of when you are in distress as a community member, perhaps you're early on in the diagnostic odyssey, or perhaps there is a change or a difficulty with either your own or your child's health, a Facebook group may be one of the first places that people turn to for help. And as a patient leader, it's you will probably be having an eye on your Facebook groups and communities, and sometimes it's difficult to know when to intervene and when to step back and let things unfold, and other community members step in and support someone who may be in distress or in crisis. But what I would encourage you to do is make clear on your Facebook groups, if you're moderating them, say they are only moderated on certain hours, or indeed it is an unmoderated group. Always put crisis lines somewhere on there. And if you are the sort of key moderator for a group, try and have a co-moderator, someone who you can say to, this is happening, how do you think we should deal with this? And of course, I would say that's your mentors can help with that too, managing things like your Facebook communities. So the other area where it's really important to find boundaries is around roles and relationships and managing expectations. And I think this is where it gets really interesting and quite tricky for you as rare leaders, because there may be times when you find yourselves caught between competing demands between your community, perhaps your board or your trustees, and perhaps your own desires or intuition about the right way forward or the right way to respond in a situation. And one of the things that is very much part of learning to become a patient leader is how you negotiate all those different sorts of relationships that you are now pivotal to. And your mentors are certainly those who would be very supportive and very helpful in thinking through with you sometimes the pressures that come from different places at different times. Some of those will be inner pressures and some of them will be external pressures from others. But I was going to give a few pointers here about managing expectations. And I think the first one goes back a bit to passion. We all care deeply about our communities and want them to succeed and thrive and to offer as much as we can to those that we are supporting. That comes with a danger sometimes of over-promising. A desire to do something doesn't mean we are able to do something at that particular moment in time. So that goes back a bit to the sort of passion goggles and pressing pause. What can I realistically offer in my situation as the patient leader I am with my community at this time? What's possible right now? Clarifying what you can and can't do or will or won't do is really helpful up front. I was talking to someone recently who was supporting a member of their community, and the member of their community was asking if the patient leader could come along to a particularly difficult meeting they had to manage in the upcoming weeks. And that patient leader was really torn because they very much wanted to go with this person. They knew how difficult that meeting was going to be for them. They had a lived experience from their own background of what might be involved in that. And they very much wanted to be able to support this patient leader. But in talking it through in their group, what became very apparent is what it would cost that patient leader to actually go and be with that individual through that meeting. And by that cost, I don't mean a financial cost, but I mean in terms of what it would mean for them emotionally at the particular point they were at in their life, stepping back in a very real way to something they had a felt sense of, but also the practical limitations that would be placed upon them. They would need to arrange childcare, they would need to take some time off their own work. It was something that they just weren't able to do, but they felt very guilty, back to that, knowing how much they would have liked someone to be there. But unfortunately, they just weren't, as that patient leader in that particular moment in time, able to offer it to that individual. What, however, they were able to think about with their group was, I can have a call with them beforehand, I can set up a phone call with them afterwards, and I can write a supporting letter to the person that they are going to be dealing with at the other end. So that's back to a very practical way of going, I'd like to be able to do A, but I can't, but I can do B. And actually the community member was really, really grateful for that, and also was really pleased that the patient leader was able to say, I just can't do that. I need you to know that. And for them both to be able to be upfront with each other. The patient community member didn't feel demanding, and the community leader didn't feel demanded of. So that's win-win. I always talk a little bit about resisting urgency and remembering you're not a crisis service. And again, this goes back to your vulnerability as rare leaders. You will understand and have a sense of how important it is sometimes, how urgent it can feel to want to talk to someone when you're in distress or in crisis or dealing with something that is new and unknown. But I just want you to give yourselves permission to accept you are not crisis services. Crisis services exist out there in the community. They may work imperfectly, but they do exist. So I always say, don't feel that you are managing on your own. There are organisations like the Samaritans. There are other very good organisations that are available to provide mental health support in both an ongoing way or in a crisis way. It will not be perfect, and very often it won't be perfect, but it's back to that idea of being pragmatic about what you can offer in the context in which you're doing it without too much cost to yourself, because it's important you look after yourself too. And the other thing that the most useful thing when I started being a manager actually was my colleague at the time saying, take any task or project time frame and double it, because things will always take much longer than you think they will. Someone also said to me, that's not a bad principle either for if you're starting to get involved in costings and budgets for things. Do a costing and a budget and think, oh, that's probably what it will cost, and then probably double it, because we notoriously as people underestimate time and money commitments for things. And back again, if you're feeling under pressure at all, pressing that pause button. Just a few tips here about if you need to say no to someone. sometimes if you are someone who, and you will be like this to some extent as a rare leader, your impulse will always be to say yes. Because you will have met so many no's or so many closed doors over your journey with the rare condition, you don't want to be someone who says no or not now. There will always be a bit of an inner struggle. But sometimes you will need to. And sometimes a sort of a trick you can offer up to yourself with that is blaming a third party, saying, I'd love to be able to help, but my trustees, my community, or my funders would be unlikely to agree that right now. So if you have a sense that this is perhaps a project or a task you can't step into at this particular moment, but you're not quite sure how to say no, defer it over to someone else. Or sometimes you can offer up an alternative. You may really wish to invest in something and you think, we can't quite. Offer that up. We can't do X right now, but we could do Y. How does that sound? So that's a way of keeping involved, keeping in, but perhaps in a way that feels more manageable for you as an individual at that particular moment in time. Okay. I have talked a lot in there. I've given you a lot to digest, I'm aware, in one go. So maybe this would be a good point to go back into groups. This will be in different groups now. If you need to grab a cup of tea or a glass of water to go back into this group, what I'd like us to do now is we're going to be in a small group again. Think about, with others in the group, what do you personally find most challenging in terms of establishing a work-life balance? And really what I want you to focus on there, what are the most difficult boundaries for you to establish as an individual? And I want you to think there about inner boundaries and outer boundaries. What are the things that you personally find most difficult to keep established? I can share mine with you, which is one of the things that I am always vulnerable to, is if anyone starts a phrase with, Kym, we've got this really interesting project that we'd really like you personally, because you'd be great at it, to be involved in. So anything that starts with, we'd really like you because you'd be great at it, I find it really difficult to say no to, even if I don't have the time or the energy or the resource for that particular moment in time. So it's partly knowing sort of what can you be got on? I can sort of be really, I'm a sucker for that one. You be great at this, Kym. I'm like, yes, sign me up. And it's not always something I should be doing as an individual or for Rareminds at any one particular time. So what are the sort of phrases or what are the encounters that you find difficult to keep established when you're thinking about your work? And what can you do? How can you sort of support and start thinking, what could I do differently? Does that need to looking at my inner boundaries or my outer boundaries, or both? And just talk about it together. See what you recognize and share with each other. So Hannah, I think we're going to have another 10 to 15 minutes in different small groups this time. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll send everyone off into your groups now.
Perfect. And I'll see you back here. And if you can elect a leader again to do some feedback, and we can have a bit more conversation after those groups. Brilliant. I'll see you all shortly. Okay, so I just wanted to end on this point really, which is that accepting limitations and bearing disappointment are one of the hardest things that any rare leader has to come to terms with, because you have birthed your organizations out of not wanting to accept limitations and having been disappointed. But very much one of the things that goes hand in hand with running a small organization is it is not possible to do everything. You won't always get it right, and there will be always unmet need. However, I also want to flip that around and say, have a think about how much is now in the world that was not there before your organization came into existence. Because it is the very fact of your organization's existence that makes the most powerful and significant difference to those impacted. And that's because they know, any one member of your community knows that there are others out there in the world who know something of what it is like to be living with this condition. And fundamentally, over and above anything else that you ever do, that's the most powerful support you can give to both your community's emotional, mental and health well-being, but also in beginning to progress and raise the profile of your community for treatments and hopefully cures or responses in the longer run. So the fact that you exist is the most powerful thing you do. You've brought your communities into existence and you are growing them. And every little plant grows in its own way, in its own time. So one of the things I often say too is try not to compare yourself too early to what other organisations are doing. And we all do it. I know I do it. Oh, look what they're doing. Oh, if only we could do that, if we had a bit more money or time or people. Be where you are, celebrate where you are and enjoy where you are, because you will grow. There are people around you who will help you grow. So just to end, as I was saying, all this stuff around boundaries and becoming a leader in a way that is sustainable and workable for you is an ongoing project. So it's a work in progress all the time. And learning to prioritize your own self-care as part of this is a very active, ongoing project. Addressing your own needs is not selfish, it's absolutely essential. And I always, love that image of you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to take care of yourself first. You guys keep the show on the road with your communities. And as leaders, we all need support with that project. Finding the right boundaries and the right relationship to our communities as individuals is a really tricky task. And we all need support, and we need to encourage each other and give each other permission to either step in sometimes or step back at other points. So all of this is completely and totally normal. And it's why it's really great and a pleasure to run workshops like this, because this is part of building what I think we always need as communities of leaders to help support each other do this sort of work. So just to sort of say, reinforce the idea, there are support networks out there. We have the fantastic Beacon doing things like this and building mini communities of leaders. You have things like the community check-ins at places like Genetic Alliance. And we've run in the past, which I know some of you here have been on, in partnership with Genetic Alliance, what we call the Building Rare Resilience 12-week programme, which is groups of small leaders who come together, talk and learn with other leaders and support each other in your leadership roles. So if you're interested in that, the person to contact is Izzy Rundle at Genetic Alliance. I'm a big fan too of building into things like funding bids, support for yourselves, consultancy, mentoring or supervision, whatever you feel is needed. And finding trustees who also have an interest in leadership development, who have perhaps backgrounds in coaching or psychology or therapy backgrounds that could become part of your more formal support network within your organisations. And just to say here, this is how you can contact us at Rareminds. We're always really happy to be contacted for information about what we do, or if you are really struggling as a patient leader and wondering where to go to have more support or help, we're around for that too. And just to say on that note that Hannah's kindly agreed to circulate a survey link that we have out at the moment called Rare Minds Matter, which is really about trying to get a bigger picture and an overview of the mental health needs of your communities in order to drive funding and resources and support for your communities. But we need to have a bigger picture around what the specific needs are in specific communities. So if you would be able to both fill that out yourselves, but also circulate it to your community members, we'd be really, really grateful. And I'm just going to finish up with 3 books that I found really helpful in my life, and I'm going to recommend one to you. One is the lovely Julie Smith, who's written the book Why Has No One Told Me This Before, which is just a really good emotional well-being support book, loads of really great little strategies and observations in there. a really useful book as well called The Happy Healthy Nonprofit, which has got some really great case studies and things like time management sheets that you can print off and fill out if you like doing that sort of thing, other pointers. And then other books I read recently, which is challenging the idea that we have to be working and we have to be on all the time. It's saying it's okay to step back. It's all right to have time to do other things and time for ourselves. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop there. We have 2 minutes to go, which I'm always really excited when we fit into a time slot that I've been agreed. So I hope that's helpful. And in the last couple of minutes, if there's anything anyone wanted to feed back or wanted to just throw out there as a handy hint for other leaders on the call, please do. It's been a real pleasure to meet with you all today. So last words from anyone.